fix my view. Okay, we're gonna start now. You ready?
Ready.
Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a Lit Friday. Good afternoon, Augustonians, and welcome to this special edition of Lit Friday. The August Wilson African American Cultural Center, in an effort to represent as many of the places that our diaspora has carried us as possible, is excited to participate in Latinx History Month, an acknowledgement of our extended community through the Caribbean and Latin America. Today, I am honored to speak with Marisel Vera, author of the novel, The Taste of Sugar. This is the cover. What I wanted to say is that it is an amazing episodic narrative, and it uses family and romance to examine Puerto Rico's complicated history with slavery, race, political independence, and United States as empire in Caribbean territories. The New Yorker has described The Taste of Sugar as a capacious novel that tells the story of a Puerto Rican family against the backdrop of the Spanish-American War in 1898. The Oprah magazine describes the novel as an illuminating work of historical fiction that sheds light on a forgotten chapter in the American story through characters who burrow into your bones and whisper in your ear. Marisel Vera is a Chicago writer that is based in Pittsburgh. Through her work, Vera explores the particular burdens that Puerto Ricans on the island and in the diaspora carry as colonial subjects of the most powerful country in the world. Her latest novel, The Taste of Sugar, from Liveright Publishing, is a tale of love and endurance on the eve of the Spanish-American War, told through two Puerto Rican families. Vera is also the author of If I Bring You Roses, from Grand Central, a story about a Puerto Rican couple who moved to the United States during the 1950s Operation Bootstrap to chase the American dream in Chicago factories. And lucky enough for us, she's currently at work on a novel about 4 Puerto Rican girls growing up in 1970s Chicago. And the working title for that is The Girls from Humboldt Park. Welcome, Marisel. We're very, very happy to have you. Muchísimas gracias for joining us. You're gonna share from The Taste of Sugar now, right?
Yes, thank you so much. That was a great introduction. I think my best so far, just want to say.
You have to do the work.
Yes. I would like to read a little section from each of the characters because the novel is mostly 2 characters. So just so you could get a flavor of their perspective. The first one is Valentina Sanchez, and from chapter 2, French Mademoiselles circa 1889. Before Valentina Sanchez met Vicente Vega, she was just a girl wishing for romance and adventure like in the French novels she loved. Her best friend, the wealthy Dalia, was to marry the Spanish caballero she met in Paris on a visit to a new exhibit called the Eiffel Tower. At night, it was lit by gaslight. It reached the clouds, Valentina. Valentina feared that the closest she would ever get to the Eiffel Tower was a drawing Dalia had sketched on the back of a missile. In the tiny bedroom of her parents' small house in Ponce, Valentina woke to the woodpecker's tap on a tree, to the footsteps of the tradespeople walking to La Plaza to sell their wares. The slant of morning sun sneaked in through the shuttered windows and caught her in the mosquito netting draped over her bed. Mama told her daughters not to complain because there were no trips abroad or fans that peacock feathers. Valentina and her sister Elena had food to eat, didn't they? They slept in beds with mosquito netting and not in doorways, didn't they? Did they notice the mother and her naked children sleeping on the steps of the Alcaldía? Not even the mayor would help them. He said that he couldn't because tax money went first to Spain, and then there was the town's sanitation, and on top of that, he had to pay the salaries of administrators, and then bueno, always something. Listen to me, muchachas. Count your blessings like raindrops. Valentina's hometown of Ponce was a city of the very rich and the very poor, including many former slaves. Mostly the poor worked for the rich in their grand houses, but there was also a tiny middle class to which Valentina's family belonged, mainly due to the family connections on her mother's side, something that Mama reminded her husband as often as she deemed necessary. Mama was always economizando. She made do with a single servant, and a woman came just once a week to scrub the floors while she stood over her, supervising. Valentina's mother went daily to the market, cooked most of the meals, and mended the family's clothing with her daughter's help. La lavandera Claudia the Negra came with her children to collect the family's dirty laundry. The littlest child of 4 years carried a bundle of towels on her head with the care of an experienced laundress. Valentina had once heard a mother say that she didn't know how one person could eat, let alone feed a family, on the earnings of a laundress. Everywhere they saw the indignities and tragedies that came from lack of money. When the girls accompanied their mother to the cemetery to say prayers at the graves of dead relatives, they often saw silent funeral processions of barefoot men carrying a plain 3-sided wood box balanced on long poles like a crude hammock, a black cloth thrown over the cadaver. The grave diggers would flip the coffin only over a newly empty grave and dump the pauper's body head first. Beyond the marble mausoleums decorated with exquisite French porcelain roses, Elena led Valentina to an area surrounded by a wall of stone. Valentina, see over there? That's for los pobres. It's la huesera, the boneyard, where the skeletons are tossed to make room for more muertos. This section is Vicente Vegas, Chapter 3, Boyhood, circa 1880. Sometimes in whispers, Vicente and his brother Luisito called their father Raúl Vega en general. His father's temper was infamous throughout the countryside. He often overheard people say that Raúl Vega tenía mal genio o un carácter fuerte. So whenever a general inflicted scorn that scarred their skin like the slash of the whip, his older brother's eyes bored into his, say nothing. Raúl Vega had taught his sons that the way to know coffee was with your hands and your feet. When Vicente and Luisito were children, their father had set them under a bush to pick coffee berries. Vicente hadn't dared to complain about the mosquitoes and other insects that flew into his eyes and stuffed themselves up his nose. Evil branches scratched his face and tried to stop his picking. He dreamt of trees. When a tree asked him if he were a bird, Vicente observed the ghostliness of the moon. Free to come and go as it pleased, Vicente whispered, I am the moon bird. The tree whispered cuentos that the birds had brought back from other lands, tales of riches and pirates and oceans longer than days. A tree complained about the owl that kept it awake each night. Why didn't it fly down the mountain and bother those trees? The coffee trees wished that their taller cousins, the banana and plantain and guava trees, wouldn't hog up all the sunlight because they too wanted to bask in the sun. There was an eagle that perched on the crown of a tree with such delicacy. The swish of its massive wings as it flew away woke Vicente from his dream. Even Raúl Vega admitted that Vicente had the gift. Vicente's fingers need only touch the coffee berry for it to drop into his palm. He didn't mind that the berries didn't ripen all at once and that the trees must be picked over and over again throughout the harvest. He told the trees, your berries will be washed and dried and roasted to make coffee so delicious that it is a drink for the gods. Mere mortals will pay for it in gold and silver. Your berries will become coffee beans that will be transported in ships to faraway places I could never hope to see in this life or the next. Your berries will be transformed into coffee that will be served in the palaces of the most important people in the world, the kings and queens and popes. Your coffee will kiss the lips of the most beautiful señoritas and be served in cafes to idle people who will linger over tiny cups, bewitched. There are people in the world who could never live a day without you. Vicente never shared with others his conversations with the coffee trees, but it wasn't because he thought his brother Luisito would laugh at him or that his father might question his sanity. It was because it was between him and the trees. The trees liked the murmur of his voice, his words wrapped around their leaves as gentle as the nightly fog. When he ate dinner, his thoughts were of the red coffee cherry nestled in the green leaves, not the rice and beans and malanga, and not even when they had pollo fricassé, his favorite. He was back in La Finca, his gaze on the banana and plantain and guava shade trees, blessing their huge green fronds. When he examined the coffee cherries, he held his breath, exhaling only when he saw that they were healthy, that the lack of rain hadn't dried the berries, or that too much rain hadn't stripped the branches bare. When the green berries ripened, they would glisten on his palm like rubies.
Thank you, Marisel. And just for historic context for people who are with us, slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865. Then it was abolished in Puerto Rico in 1871, Cuba in 1888, and Brazil in 1889. And so the historic trajectory of integration, of racial integration into open society outside of the end of slavery took on a different kind of trajectory in each of these places based on when slavery was abolished. The Spanish-American War was a political upheaval between the United States and Spain over territories that had resources that the United States wanted control over. That included the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and did it also include DR, Marisel?
I'm sorry?
Did it also include no, it didn't include DR. But what we're talking about at this moment in the late 19th century is we're talking about shifting views around race, empire, and nationhood, and also around independence. And so as we go through the questions that will illuminate the wonderful novel that Marisel has written, we're going to be touching on subjects having to deal with that. And so my first question is about the status of territory of Puerto Rico in relation to the United States, and how your novel really, really pays intricate attention to how Puerto Ricans of all races were disenfranchised via the economic relationship to the United States, and still to this extent today. There are many things that happen in the novel that mirror contemporary events. And so one is the fact that Puerto Rico, people who are residing in Puerto Rico cannot vote for the president, but Puerto Ricans do have to pay federal taxes. And so there's this kind of misalignment financially and politically, but there is political influence in Puerto Rico because of the extension of the diaspora into New York and into other places around the United States, like Chicago, for instance. Could you say more about the contemporary political relationship and the relationship in the novel?
Yes, and I want to say that I think slavery ended in Puerto Rico in 1873.
73, thank you.
Yeah, a couple years later. How it's the same, how it's then and now. Well, I think that it was interesting because during that period, there were the Puerto Rican elites, Criollo elites, wanted to have, they wanted autonomy from Spain. So they were advocating for it. And it's kind of like that now, I think, in Puerto Rico still, because I know that some of my relatives, whenever I talk to my relatives, they never talk about having really anything political regarding to the United States, because there are other issues that are more important to them. Mm-hmm. Like when Spain, the novel, I started it in Spain, when Spain had Puerto Rico as a colony, because I wanted to show how Puerto Rico was a colony of Spain for over 400 years. And it's been a colony of Puerto Rico, of the United States for like almost 120 years, something like that. And so it's really been a colony. It's the oldest colony in the world. And I don't think that things have really changed since that period and since now. When it was a colony of Spain and also the United States, but they had to send the money to Spain. The money went to Spain, and that's the reason that the infrastructure was in really bad shape during the Spanish-American War. And right after, that period is very important because right after the Spanish-American War, less than a year later, there's this huge hurricane similar to Hurricane Maria, San Ciriaco. And the infrastructure is in terrible shape because the money went to Spain. And once Spain knew that they were going to go have war with the United States, which they really didn't want. I read somewhere where there was a point where they were willing to offer Puerto Rico to the United States, but it was very important for the US to still go into the war because they wanted to have the support of the American people to have this war. And so that's what especially they played up, like Puerto Ricans wanted to be free. They were going to save Puerto Ricans and help Puerto Ricans be independent, never part of their plan. And they were also doing that in Cuba.
Right.
But it was not part of their plan. It was to have a free Puerto Rico. During that period, it was right after the Civil War and in the United States, the US Civil War, and the farmers had a lot of crops to sell. There was a lot of industry. The US already had a relationship with Puerto Rico in terms of trade, but they thought if it's part of our territory, then we could have more access to the markets. It was all about money. We could have more access to the markets, and then we could have like the land. And so basically the Spanish-American War was fought for the money, for the land, and not to free these islands that, but that was like part of the propaganda that was given to, was fed to the American people. Let's free these poor people. You know, they're suffering under Spain. The US was very against Spain, and they got the support of the US, of the American people. And also one really interesting sidebar is that after the Civil War, the men the soldiers after the Civil War had sons. And the sons were very in awe of their fathers having fought in the Civil War. They wanted to be like their fathers. Mm-hmm. They wanted to fight. They wanted military glory. So this was a chance for those men to have military glory. If you look everywhere in the US, including Pittsburgh by the universities, there's a statue of 3 or 4 soldiers who fought in the Spanish-American War. And it says Puerto Rico on it. Have you seen it?
It's right near Soldiers and Sailors, right?
I'm sorry?
Near Soldiers and Sailors, across from the University of Pittsburgh. Right. This is this major museum in Pittsburgh. For those of us who are watching from outside of Pittsburgh, I'm sure everybody knows that this is watching who's in Pittsburgh. But I'm also interested in how, with the way that the politics are at the time and how nationhood is a question, we see how race is formulated within the countryside in Puerto Rico. Then we see it in the urban spaces of Puerto Rico. Then we see how race is constructed in Hawaii when the characters migrate for work. And then we see the American perspective of race entering into Puerto Rico over time. And you're able to show the complicated nature of what Americans would call white and Black relations. And how it transforms via personal relationships even. So when you open the novel, the first image that we get of someone who's like Afro-Puerto Rican or a Black Puerto Rican is Benedicto. And it's during slavery because he is Raul Vega's father's slave. He's enslaved to him. And so there's this point where you describe the hard work of being a coffee farmer. And then there's this transition from Benedicto as an enslaved Black person, literally into the resource, into the coffee. And I wanted to know why you began the novel with that image, because in the tradition of multi-generational novels from the Caribbean and Latin America, the presence of Afro-Latinos in slavery is either not discussed at all or it's heavily romanticized. You're not doing either of those things in this. So could you talk about why you began with that image?
Yes, I wanted to really talk about race. And because I am a fiction writer, I have to say it in a story. That's how you show what you are concerned about or what you want to put attention to. And as a Puerto Rican woman, I've heard so much in my life how Puerto Ricans aren't racist. So I wanted to show, yes, we are. And Benedicto is important because he is the one who knows about coffee. He is the one who teaches his master about coffee. He is the one during that period where they're going in Utuado, you had to like rip up the land in order to prepare it for coffee, like the grass or whatever. And that's physical labor. So he's the one that does that. And his master, is supervising him, so I thought it was important. I thought it was important to have Benedicto because of that, because I wanted to write a little bit about slavery. I wanted to write a little bit about race. And I wanted to continue that with some of the later characters who are not related to Benedicto, but one was a former slave, Alegro. Villanueva was a former slave, and how that his descendants and how that affected his descendants. And throughout the book, I try to maybe plant these little seeds about racism throughout and how people view racism and the phrases that we use as Puerto Ricans to continue the racism, like un prieto pero buena gente, something like that. That is
but a good person.
Yeah, that is still used nowadays. I've heard it. When I was working on The Taste of Sugar, it did give me pause to write about racism because I am a light-skinned Puerto Rican woman, but I thought it was important. And I thought, I'm going to write it. I'm going to try to do it in a way where I can enlighten. And it has to serve the story. Ultimately, everything that you write has to serve your story. But I wanted to kind of, maybe not honor, but throw light on that part in the history. And that's why I have him go to La Plaza. I wanted to show how, in a way, when he's in La Plaza in the very beginning, Benedicto and some other enslaved men kind of nod to each other, and that's what they did. This is factual. I found it somewhere in one of the books when I was doing Puerto Rican history, because that's kind of like they acknowledge each other's humanity when others wouldn't acknowledge it.
And another way that you demonstrate this relationship is via Raulito and his brother Vicente Vega, because Raul, who's the father of them both, had Raulfo Eusenia, who's an Afro-Puerto Rican woman who's living in the campo around the hacendado that Raul runs. And so within the relationship between the two half brothers, I don't think at home we really go by halves, we just say our brothers, is we don't go by halves at home, we just say our brothers.
Yes.
We see how Raulito is treated via the racism of the father, that Vicente as his brother is trying to circumvent with love, compassion, and care. But then we see how Vicente is also brought into a structure of racism when they're outside of the family, and they're trying to protect one another and be present for one another, as Vicente experiences a racism from people who are white and American, and Raulito experiences the double racism from people who are white and American and also Puerto Ricans who do not appear to have any Black ancestry. And so I wanted you to talk more about the relationship between these two brothers, because on one hand, it is romantic. They're very supportive and dedicated and loyal to one another, but that strength in their relationship, it never is broken. It's never broken by the different facets of racism that they experience throughout the story. And I think that that's something important, because I think about Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark and how she reads critically against white writers and how their inability to discuss Blackness or humanize their Black characters destroyed certain parts of their writing. Yeah. But you don't step into that. You really step up to the complicatedness of this. And this relationship is one way you do it. Could you talk about that more?
Yes, and I think maybe the problem with a lot of some white writers is that they don't see people of color as people. They see them as characters, or that they could write about. But Vicente and Raulito, I feel that Vicente stepped up and is kind of like a surrogate father to Raulito. And that's why he feels so much about Raulito so strongly in certain parts of the novel, and it hits him so hard when things happen to Raulito. And I think he does see him as a brother. And I think that the way their father Raul Vega, the way he treats women in general in his life, really affected Vicente's viewpoint about what is decent or the right way to treat women and people. So, and Vicente having this, he met Raulito when he was very young, like 5 or 6 years old, and he has like he wants to like do good because his father didn't when he learns. And he's just a decent man. Just ultimately a decent man, and has a more, almost like his understanding is by instinct, I think. So he just knows this is wrong. I don't want to be like my father. This is a sweet kid. And he sees like the injustice, like in his own family. His parents hired a maestro ambulante, somebody who came during that period. Teachers came to them, people who could afford it. Maybe the teachers got just like room and board, but they stayed with the family and they taught the kids how to read and write. And that didn't happen to Raulito, and Vicente thought that was, unfair. So he taught them to read and write. And he also taught Eusebia, Raulito's mother. And for me, I feel that Raul Vega definitely took advantage of Eusebia. It was not something consensual. You saw it that way?
Right. I did see it that way as well. And that's a great, because I do want to turn to facets of machismo and misogyny and how it's played out in the text. And it's interesting because we have Angelina, who is the mother of Vicente, but not Raulito, right? But Vicente, right. And how she has kind of suffered what in the novel is called poco vergüenzas, or little shames, which is cheating on the part of Raul. And at one point, it's almost insinuated very softly that she takes one of Raul's mistresses as her life partner in the absence of any affection between her and her husband. And I wanted you to talk more about how this queered relationship, because it's not explicit in the novel. I also don't want to give it away. This queered relationship, this relationship of affinity and affection between two women abuts against the misogyny that's represented via Raul's actions and other places in the novel where it almost seems just like commonplace for women to be spoken about or above in a certain way. And then the agencies that the women take to counteract that in conversation, et cetera.
Well, I think that queer people have been around forever. And people whisper about it and don't really talk about it, at least certainly during this period, openly. Right. I was interested in that. And I was interested in writing about the reality of the Puerto Rican culture, because I grew up in it. And I still like it. It's still like that now, still. So I was interested in definitely exploring it during that period and imagining how it might be. And I feel that Angelina and Inez, like their relationship, is something that could have happened.
Right.
And why? What was the rest of your question?
No, I'm thinking about how that relationship and how it functions, like shines a light on the machismo, the misogyny, in general, the culture represented in the book at that time.
Yes, and I feel like in a way that was like, okay, Raul, you're going to do that. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this, and you don't have to like it, but you're going to kind of respect it. And Raul was el jefe, so if he had really wanted to, he could have, kick them both out or whatever, and the women would have had no recourse. But Angelina had come from a family that had some money, had brought it into the marriage, and that's why the farm was saved. Things aren't so great financially for Raul Vega at this time because his father, who starts off on Don Luis Manuel, had to sell pieces of the land because the coffee, they live and work in coffee, and coffee is at the it's at the expense of the market, or it's tied to the market. So it's like if coffee is doing very well, then the price of coffee goes up. If it's not doing well, it goes down. And they have to deal with the merchants, and the merchants have to deal with the outside markets, kind of now, just like now. So with Angelina and Inez, I think that Inez was at a point where this is not working for me. I'm lonely. What is this my life? She would look out the window. Vicente would talk at one point, why do the women in this life always look out the window?
Right.
Because the women during that period, his mother and also his wife, they're limited as to what they can aspire to. They're limited by society, they're limited by their culture, they're limited by money, they're limited by being up in the mountain, and the towns are so far away, the roads are crude and dangerous at night. They wouldn't be able to travel on their own. So this is something that kind of a beautiful thing in a way that happens for Angelina and for Inez. And I have to give Raul Vega a tiny bit of credit that he's just like, okay, this is what you want. I'm not even going to think about it,
I also, there seems to be, you mentioned the land, and the land, especially the weather, seem like characters in their own right. They have their own personalities, and they have their own narrative over time of what they do, and it shows how it affects politics and money and the individuals. Even when you were reading, there are very lush descriptions that give the nature, the flora, the fauna, this aspect of being very in control of everything in the end, especially when we're talking about Huracan Santriaco and how it just flattens everything. It destroys even the urban areas. It destroys especially the mountain. Could you talk about what you were thinking about or how you felt through the nature that's represented in the novel? Was it a character for you? And for you, what was the most important thing about the relationship between the weather, nature, and the characters? I mean, nature is also pretty political in this, which is amazing.
Yes, nature is very, very important. On a personal level, it's very important to Vicente because he is rooted in the land. He has the same love for the land as he has for his family. So when he's uprooted, it's like devastating. But I love writing about the land in Puerto Rico because for a couple of reasons. One, because I think about my father, who always wanted to go back to Puerto Rico and buy a little finca on the mountains and grow coffee, raise chickens, and he was never able to do that. He left Puerto Rico when he was 18 during Operation Bootstrap and had children, worked in factories, and he could never realize that dream. So I always have that in my mind when people have to leave a place that they love and hope to return, and then they can't or they don't for whatever reason. And also I have a personal connection with Puerto Rico, even though I wasn't born there. But the first time I felt this connection was when I was 18 years old. And my sister and I had saved our money for a whole year from our jobs after school and on the weekends so that we could go to Puerto Rico. It was the first time we were going to go. Our parents were not among the Puerto Ricans who could afford to go every year because my father worked in a factory. There were 6 kids. There was no money. But when we went, and the moment I stepped off the plane and on the tarmac, because that's when you stepped on the tarmac, and just felt like the heat and the humidity, and I saw the palm trees, I just felt like this physical and spiritual an emotional connection to Puerto Rico that has never left me. So when I write about, especially personally in Vicente's point of view about the land, I draw on that. As a writer, you draw on your own emotions and experiences if you can. And so, you know, I close my eyes and I think about that feeling, and that's how I wrote about Vicente on a personal level and his love for the land. But the land is very important, and so is climate, just like now in Puerto Rico. Climate is very important, and the infrastructure relates to the climate, because if the infrastructure hadn't been in such bad shape during the period of my novel, because of the Spaniards' lack of attention to it, like they wanted all the money for themselves, and also the Americans, because the Americans were there a whole year. You know, they could have done something, repair some bridges, possibly for that. And now the money for the infrastructure for the last 3 years has been going to pay the debt to Wall Street instead of the infrastructure. So you get Hurricane San Ciriaco, you get Hurricane Maria, and it hits the island with such ferocity, and the infrastructure is in terrible shape. What happens? You know, there's flooding. The bridges collapse. Houses are lost, and they go down the river.
And also there's a way that the weather the lack of infrastructure to counteract the severity of the weather due to climate change, especially right now, that it kind of tightens the reins of certain kinds of oppressions that are already in the island, because all of a sudden you don't have the resources. And so there ends up being this struggle for resources. Because I also noticed that the people who produce the natural resources often didn't have access to them. So there was this running theme. I think that's why I got the title, the Taste of Sugar, that the people who produce the sugar often were not the people that could actually consume the sugar as much as the sugar consumed them and its production. Or even coffee. There came a certain point where Vicente couldn't even partake of his own product as somebody who was growing the resources. And so I think that that's also a part of how weather and politics works, by creating that stress. But could you talk about the kind of, not conflation, but the parallels between the resources of sugar and coffee and then the people and their lack of access to it?
Yes, but I wanted to talk a little bit about disaster diplomacy.
Yes.
That's what happened then, and that's what's happening now. After Hurricane San Ciriaco, the island is devastated, and the Puerto Ricans are given charity by American citizens. Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York, and McKinley put Theodore Roosevelt in charge of writing to the newspapers and asking the American people to contribute to help out Puerto Rico. And just like Hurricane Maria, the American people are the ones that sent the money, not the government. And to be clear, there wasn't FEMA at that time, during the time of San Ciriaco. But what happened then and what is happening now? So the island is in bad shape. The coffee crop is gone. Vicente's coffee crop is gone. He's not the only one. But so then if you can't grow coffee, you can't sell coffee. What happens? Okay, something out of my computer. You can't pay like your taxes. Am I still there? I feel like.
Yeah, you're still here.
Okay, something's happening in my computer. Okay, cool. So then he has to, people like him have to give up their land, and the Americans are there to buy it very cheap, just like now, just like exactly what is happening with Puerto Rico now.
Right. And so
diplomacy.
One parallel I also saw between that is that in Utao, there's no school, there's no schooling system. Yes. There were peripatetic teachers that would come and become private instructors for families. Right. But after Hurricane Maria, the infrastructure for education was completely lost. And there were accounts in American news that were talking about how it would take 2 or 3 hours for children to come to schools that were closer to cities or larger towns, because their primary schools that were in their more rural areas were destroyed and people couldn't get access to resources. And then you kind of think about how it's not about seeing the island as a resource, as far as like people and community. The people are the sugar. The people are the coffee to the imperialist state, which was the United States. And instead of seeing people for what their immediate needs are in order for them to continue producing, they're treated just like the resource. We can shuffle around, move around, we can control and we can dictate what you do and do not have access to. But
Yes.
there's still, even amongst the Boricua community here in the United States, the idea that, you know, like the relationship or what America has provided to the island is great. And that's even sometimes across classes. Like there are people who would be considered to be like the urban poor who consider that as well. And then we even see this by the time that Vicente and Valentina arrive in Hawaii for work. We see that there are even still people in their community that are like, oh, we're here and this is happening, but there's still this small voice that's still interested in becoming a part of the imperial structure in hopes to arise from being agricultural workers into citizens.
Yeah, I wanted to say that part of the problem is the erasure of your history. And so when you don't know your history, the history of your country, the history of your people, and when you only know the history of your colonizer, it affects you. You know, you are aligned with your colonizer. And this is a problem that a lot of Puerto Ricans have now, and especially the ones here in the United States, because we didn't know our history. We weren't taught it in our books. And my mother was an excellent student in Puerto Rico. She graduated from high school. She was offered a scholarship to go to teachers college, but she didn't take it because she was ashamed that she didn't have shoes. She could not go to the university barefoot. And looking back at that now, I'm like, oh my God, I can totally see that, because other people in the university were these elite kids, and my mother being there with her one dress and barefoot. Would I do that? I don't know. But she told me that her books were in English and she didn't learn any Puerto Rican history. When I was researching the taste of sugar, I would call my mother and I would say, Mommy, did you know this? And Mommy rarely knew it. She was so interested in everything I had to tell her. She was very interested in history, and she was very glad to learn these historical facts that she didn't know. So I think that is a problem with white supremacy. If you don't know your history, if you don't know where you came from, you don't know your heritage, if you are not given tools to help you think on your own, and that's part of the thing, those tools are not offered to you. You have to seek them, because if they are offered, you might want change, and change is not good for the people in power. So that's one reason why I think The Taste of Sugar is important, my novel. And that's one reason that I wrote it. I wrote it because I wanted to discover where I came from, who I was, who my people were, beyond the cultural knowledge that I had. I had the knowledge about the sugar and the food, not the sugar, but the sugar too, about the food and the culture and people as people, but I didn't know the history. So growing up in Chicago, it was very difficult because I didn't know where I belonged. I didn't know, was I Puerto Rican? Was I American? I heard that I was American. If I was Puerto Rican, how was that? What's this Commonwealth deal? I don't know. What is Estado Libre Asociado? What the heck is that? So writing The Taste of Sugar, and my first novel too, has really helped ground me in being Puerto Rican.
We actually have an audience question about reception. And the question reads, I'm curious about other Boricua thoughts on the book. did the Puerto Rican community feel it gave them permission to also have these complicated conversations about race? So since the book has been out, it just came out in June, right?
Yes, June.
It just came out in June. So between June and now, have you had any kind of outstanding conversations that have stuck with you with other people from the community who have had contact from the book? Have you noticed that there are different perspectives across age? Have you noticed that there was resistance to how you very openly talk about race?
It's received really wonderful reviews and wonderful feedback. Two historians who are Puerto Rican historians love it and told me that one of them wrote me an email and said that he learned things he didn't know. And we're hoping to do an event together. And that was really gratifying because I asked my editor to send it to him. I was afraid of what he would say, but then I thought I'll hide under, I'm a fiction writer, I can't get everything right. But he just loved it. And we're hoping to do an event together. And this other Puerto Rican historian also loved it. But one thing that is interesting, I got an email from a retired professor who told me a story about her family in San Ciriaco. She said that she remembers that her mother, she's older than me, that her mother was told her about a great uncle who during San Ciriaco, the family's house was deemed unsafe. So the great uncle got this big board and he put it between his house and the neighbor's house. And they were like going from one house to the next. Well, a couple of the relatives made it to one house to the next, but that great uncle didn't, and neither did the rest of the people in the house. The river rose and took them away. And this uncle and his family were waving goodbye to the other people in the house and never saw them again.
Wow. Just taken on the river of it.
And that happens in the novel. All the historical facts about the hurricane, and pretty much all the historical facts, they're historical facts. But everything about the hurricane, I didn't make up about what happened. My people are fictional. And their own personal lives are fictional, but the historical stuff is factual. Maybe rendered in a fictional way.
I am very, very interested in how you use the characters you use the political, social, and climactic context to create characters that are really products of those things. And then their individuality is shown via how they respond to those things that externally form them. How did you think up a Valentina? How did you think up a Benedicto? How did you think up, a Raul Vega? How did you think up a Gloria? How did you come up with all of these different, very specific personalities that managed to not fall into tropism? Like Gloria works in the house with Angelina Vicente, Valentina, and Raul. She is their domestic helper, but at the same time, she has her own personality and she has boundaries around what she will and will not do. And that's agency. Can you talk about how you managed all of these different characters?
Well, as a writer, some of it is a gift, but I usually, the way I start writing is I think about what is the story that I want to tell? And then I think, who is going to tell my story? And the story that I really wanted to tell, I wanted to talk about Puerto Rico. I wanted to kind of tell the history of Puerto Rico during a period and a certain period, a time frame. And I wanted to talk about the Puerto Ricans who went to Hawaii because that's what first intrigued me when I learned that fact. And once I learned that fact, I went backwards and researched, why did they have to leave? And that helped me decide who my characters would be. I always have to include a love story if I can, because I love to, because it's fun. Because personally, I feel that having a little bit of laughter and music and love makes the really hard stuff bearable, kind of like in our lives, even right now, when you have the community with your children or with a friend, or you have music, it helps you bear the really tragic things that happen to you in your lives. so that's where the family comes in. But Valentina, I thought of, I always have to write in a woman's voice because I feel that women are underrepresented in everywhere, every place. And also in the Puerto Rican culture, often our voices are asked to be silent or lowered or less passionate. So I'm like, got it right in a Puerto Rican woman's voice. So I could just knock that out of the way, myself. And then I'm very interested in the male point of view because I feel like I really understand Puerto Rican men and their trials through my father. And I think that colonialism towards Puerto Rico and immigration, it's all, you were talking earlier about how the people are expendable and the people they just want to be used. The people also were like a commodity to the US, which is one of the reasons they wanted Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, because they thought cheap labor. We don't have to pay them hardly anything. They're really good at, we hear they're really good at sugar. We should, plant sugar. It'd be a lot cheaper than planting it in the US, that kind of thing. So they bought up the land so that they could have their own huge sugar plantations. Wow. And when people immigrate, that's part of the colonialism plan. Just like now with Hurricane Maria, if people leave the island, then there's less competition for jobs. So you don't have to work too much on the unemployment problem. You don't have to work too much on the infrastructure problem. You don't have to put too much money into the schools, that kind of thing, because less people. So that's an advantage for the governments when the people leave. And it's also in a way an advantage to the people who stay. In the Puerto Rican culture, we have almost like a two-tier thing politically, like the Puerto Ricans on the island and the Puerto Ricans here in the diaspora. But the ones like us in the diaspora, we benefit the ones in Puerto Rico, not just when there are climate disasters like sending money, but we benefit them because we're here, 3 million of us aren't there. Mm-hmm. So all these issues that I think about when I'm writing, and the way I deal with it, because it's very complex, especially the way I wanted to write this novel and so much I wanted to say, I take it one day at a time. I'm like, okay, today I'm going to write in Valentina's voice when she's going through the cemetery. How was it in the cemetery? How old is she? How does it look like? What does she see? What does she feel? I think like that. Sometimes if I really want to get into the atmosphere, I close my eyes and I can see like the image, or I can feel like the wind, or I can hear the birds. When Vicente is talking about the birds, I close my eyes, I can hear it. I know people think it's strange, but I can like sort of hear what's happening. I am Vicente. I am in the tree. I do see the moon. And then if I am starting work, I usually start with a pen and paper and I write a couple pages, maybe even more than that. But then I go to the laptop because it's faster and I want to write. It's coming out so fast. It's like gushing out of my subconscious, and I'm faster on the keyboard. So,
but also as a writer myself, transferring from paper to the computer for me is a great editing opportunity. I can make changes a whole lot quicker when I'm like transferring something that I've written by hand onto the computer itself. But also I wanted to talk about Valentina because she is a strong personality. I associated her personality kind of with San Ciriaco because Valentina's personality is one that instigates change. And there are many times when she has to push Vicente into taking charge or doing things. But then there are a lot of moments where Valentina has to keep secrets because she's trying to protect Vicente's manhood. And I think that that's a dualism that kind of spreads across when you think about the global South or you think about women in general in the West, it's this combination of coming forward and being a force and holding secrets back in order to protect a kind of structure. Could you talk more about that dynamic in Valentina as a character, how she manages to withhold, because she withholds something that I'm not going to give away. She withholds something in the novel that made me feel like it was her way of getting back at Vicente for not just going to San Juan when her family invited them. And so I said, for her, now this seems even, that he decided on Hawaii instead of deciding on being with her family in the city. And so could you talk about Valentina thinking about the Caribbean feminine, the Caribbean feminist, and then thinking about like this maintenance of secrets, but also this being a force for change?
Will you promise me to teach the taste of sugar sometime in a class?
I would love to.
Because you know what? These are very insightful observations and questions. I love them. I love thinking about Valentina Sanchez. Valentina, I feel, is a product of her time, but also of what she experiences. She starts off in the very beginning of the novel, like the piece that I read, maybe she's 15, 16 years old. And she's pretty frivolous because she has this very wealthy friend. She wants to be wealthy, but she's not wealthy, but she enjoys some of the trappings of wealth through her friend. And she's a reader of romance novels, French romance novels, and she dreams of running away and traveling all over the world. Like every young girl should dream, I think. But because of the things that happened to her in her life, it doesn't end up the way she dreamt. But she understands her culture very well. That during that time, it's very clear what is expected of her. Her mother, in a couple monologues, tells her what is expected of her. When she goes to live with Vicente's family, she understands, she's told what's expected of her. And she knows the consequences. She thinks about the consequences. She grows into a woman, a thoughtful woman, and also a strong woman because of the experiences in her life. And also because she has a love of Vicente. And what starts off as a whim, marrying him in a way, for her grows into something strong. And because she has a foundation later on in the period that you're talking about, The Secret, it's just the beginning of their marriage, but later on, it's kind of like coffee. Coffee takes 5 years to mature. Mm-hmm. And their love took some time to mature. But let's see what you were saying about Valentina.
And feminism. For me, she's like a very feminist character, especially towards the end when she is pushing Vicente. We need to make a change in our situation, not just for us, but for our community in the context of Hawaii when they arrived there as agricultural laborers. Yes.
And then Valentina didn't have the opportunity of having really a higher education. She did have, compared to other women of her time, especially women of color. And especially the servants, but she's smart. And imagine what she could have done if she had had the other opportunities. But this is, women were put in their place. They were in their place, and very few women moved out of their family, their roles that they were expected to lead. Yeah, so I think she would be considered a feminist now. Definitely, she grew into a strong woman.
And then also for our last question, and still focusing on Valentina's experience, it seems to me that even though she began in the space of being very kind of romantic and fantastical and only focusing on the feeling of things, that there's something about her stubbornness and determination that helps her get through all the stages she has to go through in this novel. And there's also a way that her and Vicente's relationship give a buoyancy. A lot of very stark and dark things happen in the novel around hunger, homelessness, disenfranchisement, the death of children from hunger and other kind of climactic events. People experience a lot of loss, but you have this, much like Valentina, attachment, passionate attachment to the beauty and the sacredness of the romance between the two of them. Was that where you wanted the buoyancy to be in the novel between Vicente and Valentina? Because for me as a reader, I thought, wow, they have gone through so much. But what makes the relationship uncommon is that what you would expect as a deterioration in emotional attachment doesn't really happen. It's threatened, but it doesn't really happen. Could you talk more about, I mean, of course, characters have their own minds once you get them going, but as your insight as being the omnipotent writer in your story, what was it about that romance that just wouldn't break no matter what they put each other through based on some misogynist decisions on the part of Ms. Vicente? And I mean it. And like, you know, like what helped them survive? What was it in that romance? Why was that so important to maintain?
Well, I think that I really wanted to show how Puerto Ricans have this love for life and celebration and for family, and how it's not all gloom and doom. Really bad stuff happens to them. Really bad stuff is happening now to Puerto Ricans and to the island and to people. But there's music. They have the love of music. Vicente is always teasing Valentina because she loves the cuatro guitar. Mm-hmm. You know, they love to dance. They have the love of family, and that was very important to me to show that that was for the culture. I did that to celebrate being Puerto Rican, to celebrate the Puerto Rican culture, to celebrate the Puerto Rican people. That's why all of that is in there. But with them personally, with their marriage, I wanted to show how, you know, when bad stuff happens to you, it either breaks you apart or brings you closer. It's one or the other. It rarely ever stays the same. And it brought them closer. And that's how they were able to bear things that happened to them. And you were talking earlier about Valentina. She has to keep some secrets from her husband because she knows his reaction. It's going to drive a wedge where it might change things for them. He'll see her differently, even though he might not want to, but that's the way he was raised. They're both raised in the Puerto Rican culture, and they both bring their own hangups of that culture to it. So this is the way she's navigating. She decides she has to navigate her relationship this way. And she doesn't think of it like that, but she reasons with herself. She knows what the consequences are. And in a way, she's also trying to protect him. Women are always trying to protect the men. Why do we have to do that? You know, why do we have to protect men from being angry and from doing this? Why can't they just not be angry and just, you know?
Right, or understand that as it's shown in the novel, sometimes what reality requires doesn't really match up with the gender roles that are expected of us. Sometimes we have to take a step outside of that in order to help life keep happening.
Yes.
As a way to move forward.
And in a way, that's a disservice to Valentina, unfortunately. She's sacrificing something there because she can't really be her true self. You know, so she has to find joy in where she can in her friendships with women, and, you know, with the water, you know.
Well, thank you so much, Marisel. If you guys want to know Valentina's secrets, multiple, then check out The Taste of Sugar. It's great. It's a great way to experience a wonderful, exciting, and sometimes very difficult story, while also learning about the finer points of the continued existence of colonialism and the impacts it has on diaspora and concepts of race, even here in the United States. I want to thank you again. I want to thank everybody for listening and sticking with us. And you're so generous. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We got to thank you too. We got to thank you, Marisel. Great book and great conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. You were wonderful.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.